feeling post, thank you. Feeling post lesson yesterday with our create and read functionality in our application. What are our thoughts? Right, let's get a good temperature check before we dive right back in. Okay, Omar says, haven't had too much time to review the lesson. Yeah, so I mean, that's okay, right? If you haven't reviewed the lesson, that's fine. We're just trying to get some initial thoughts, right? I wouldn't say knee jerk, right? But just kind of how are we feeling coming into class? We're getting ready to work on updating and deleting, right? So that's going to be different. Everything we've done so far has just been reading, right? Getting stuff from a database or getting something from an API. Yesterday was the first time we actually created something that not only could we add something to the DOM, but it would come back, right? Anytime you had a project before, you'd hit refresh, everything would reset. So this is a bit different, having a bit more permanent state. Timo saying, hey, all right for now. Joseph, same thing. It's almost like you're reading each other's mind. Sarah, your temperature is low. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the honesty. So, what I want for us to do is keep in mind, as always, until you're doing these things a few times, right? It's not going to cement and give yourself a little bit of grace, right? Give yourself that room to learn and grow right now. It's a good time to be in a position where there are expectations, but they're pretty low, right? It's not as if you're a senior engineer who doesn't know how to do these things. You're still learning, you're still in the process of gaining knowledge, right? And for us, we're just asking you to put the work in, doing the labs and doing the projects, which can be a lot. It can be intimidating, but we're not holding this above you. Like if you don't perform, you're not going to get, you're going to lose your job or things like that, right? So this is a good environment to learn where yes, there are consequences for not doing assignments, etc. But you do have the ability to make these mistakes safely, right? If you're not sure, you're not going to be viewed as unintelligent for not knowing something. Like we expect you to not know things. So just continue to ask those questions, continue to be open about where you're struggling, scheduling those office hours so that you can get that one-to-one support that you really need. Okay. So for today's lesson, we're going to finish up the project that we started working on yesterday. And then we're going to move on to a lab. I don't know how many people have looked ahead, but we're going to finish the cookbook project we had been working on. And then your lab is going to be like a notes taking application, but you're going to be using Supabase instead of just the temporary state, the local state. Okay. So for today's lesson, we're talking about update and delete operations. So we're getting the UD and CRUD, right? So by the end of this lesson, we should be able to apply commands to update existing records in a database, delete records from a database using Supabase queries, and manage data effectively while maintaining database integrity. So first question, get our brains working. Which file is commonly used in web development to store environment-specific configuration variables like API keys and database credentials? We have A, B, C, or D. Yeah, I would hope you wouldn't guess A or B because we haven't looked at any of those, right? D, there are settings.json files, but that's not where you're typically going to store your environment variables. So hopefully that was pretty easy to remember from yesterday. And then how do we retrieve data from a Supabase database? Is it .get, .retrieve, .select, or .fetch? Okay, we have a couple C's. Let's get a few more answers in the chat. I think I see Chris typing away down there. Yep, it's going to be C, select. So get sounds like it's what you'd want, right? You have a get or a fetch request, which those are for APIs, but that's not necessarily what we're doing here. We're utilizing the Supabase library, and they have a specific method called select, which correlates to a SQL query of select. Okay. All right. So we have the cookbook from yesterday. So we're going to be adding 3 new features. We need to get it set up, right? We need to get the routing working because it's not going to carry over from yesterday, right? So there's going to be a couple things we're going to have to do. But we're also going to be able to allow a user to update a recipe, right? What if someone makes a mistake? They should have the ability to fix that. And then also being able to remove a recipe. So once we've done all that and we really have got our project working, we're going to take a break and then you're going to have the rest of the time to work on the lab, which is going to be something that you should be able to reference what we've done here and be able to finish that lab. Okay. So again, we're pretty much set up the way we were before outside of any environment variables, right? So we're going to have to get those. But what has changed is in the recipe card component, we have 2 new buttons for editing and deleting. And then there's a new component called update, which we intend to render when the edit button is clicked, right? But we haven't done that. So we're going to need to add those things then. So for this first feature, we're going to set up our env file again. Okay. We're going to add a new route to edit existing recipes. Then we're going to implement the next feature is we're going to implement the edit functionality, and then we're going to add the delete functionality. Okay. Any questions about what we're trying to do here? Does anyone not understand what is the goal for today? Okay. Let's keep rolling. So we're not going to worry about the demo, right? Because you have to go through and edit everything out. I'm not going to mess with that. And we're going to see the demo at the end, right? We understand what's supposed to happen here. Now, we need to get our URL and API key for our project. So what we can do, I'll throw this in the link here for easy access, is we'll want to go to supabase.com/dashboard/projects. And then we're going to need to get the project that we created yesterday. Okay, so you see here I have 3 projects, 2 of them are paused. So I'm going to go to Cookbook V2 that I made. And if you remember, we scroll all the way down here and we should have 2 different things that we will take, right? We have our project URL and our API key. So I'm going to take this project URL, put it in our env file. I'm going to take this API key, put it in our env file. Okay. That's all we need to do. Again, even though they're strings, we don't need to put a quotation mark or quotation marks around them. With the env file, it's going to render it as it needs to. Okay. Makes it a little easy. We don't have to forget about that. You don't necessarily need semicolons either. It kind of breaks my heart because I use them all the time. But I just, for the sake of env files, I just don't typically add them. Okay. Anyone unable to find their API key or URL? Because we're going to need these to be able to move forward. So I don't want to blow past here if we're getting that. So if you need a minute, let me know now. Okay. So I haven't heard anything, so I'm going to assume we're good to go. All right. Now we need to set up a new route in our app file. So you see we have a couple link components, right? So we have link to / which takes us to the home component. Then one here, create, right? So before we import this component, let's talk about what we learned yesterday with the use navigate, okay? So here we have our link component. But then we also talked about yesterday being able to incorporate use navigate, right, from React Router. So we see here, if I move forward, go ahead a little bit in here. Maybe, actually, we'll go back. So in our component, or is it create here? Yeah, in our create. So we have use navigate here, right? But then our app component, we have this link component. So who can describe what the difference in these roles are, right? So use navigate was new for us yesterday. So what is the main difference between these two? They both navigate users, right? But what is the main difference? Okay. So the main difference is going to be the link component is something that replaces what you'd consider like the hyperlink, right? The A tag. This allows a user to click on an element and they can move throughout the application without a page refresh, right? So then the entire application is not re-rendered, which allows it to remain a single page application, right? That's how we are able to handle state and props and everything like that. Whereas the use navigate allows us to route a user in our React logic, right? So we see here in the create component, once the recipe is successfully created, then at that point, we're going to navigate them back to the home page. Okay. So you're not going to necessarily see if it's written well, you shouldn't see this navigate down here in the HTML, right? I mean, maybe you might see that. I would say it's probably rare. Whereas the link component is only going to be found in uh, your HTML JSX down here, unless for some reason you have a method that generates the component, right? But again, the link is going to be the component that handles the routing, whereas the use navigate allows you to route the user within the logic itself. Okay. So back to setting up a new route, we need to import this new component from our pages folder. Okay. So pretty much we can follow the same format here, right? So just be import update from pages / update, right? Because that is going to be our file name. Now we need to add a route, right, for the user to be able to get to that page. But if we're updating an existing recipe, we're going to need to be able to keep track of which recipe we're updating, right? We can't just go to update. We're not just selecting a recipe from a list in a new page. We've already selected that recipe from the main page. Okay. So when we see this as a dynamic route, what does the colon and then recipe ID here, what does that stand for? Why are we adding that after the /, right? So we're saying it should go to this update element or update component. So what does the colon recipe ID stand for? So Sarah says go to a specific recipe ID. Yes, so that's exactly it. This is going to be tied to a recipe ID, which this isn't enough to do that, right? We're going to have to add more logic. But what we're saying is this new, or let's make the route first, right? So we'll do /: recipe ID, and we're saying we want to go to the update component, right? So what we're saying is there's going to be a path here, and it's going to be based on the ID, right? So it should be whatever your URL is .com/ and then it would be ID, right? And it's going to be the update component with that ID tied. Like we're going to pass that data down into the component. So yes, you're absolutely right, Sarah. Okay. So we still have to set it up, but I want to make sure we're thinking through this dynamic routing, because if you're going to use React, this is incredibly common, right? So again, think about a blog, and I know I've shown this one before, but you would not want to have this blog where you'd have to keep doing everything over and over and over and over again, right? So what's happening here is, I don't think I still have the extension on here. It's WordPress anyway. So this is really just a template, right? And this is a dynamic route where we pass in that ID. And I think we had tried that where, okay, what would be another ID? Let's type 100, right? There is a blog with the ID of 100. Okay. So that's where it queries a database. It figures out, okay, do we have any blog posts with the ID of 100? Great. Get that information, and then it populates this page. So if I tried another one, I said 27. All right, I'm trying to come up with one that doesn't work. Okay, definitely not like this huge number, right? I hit enter. Well, now it's not found, so then it's going to route you to a 404 page. Okay. So let's move forward, right? So we have set up this route for the update component where it's going to be tied to the dynamic recipe ID. So now in our recipe card, we want to be able to move the user forward to that edit functionality, right? And there's a couple different ways we could do this. What it's showing here is that we could use a link, right? And I'm not even saying this is a bad way to do it. It's actually a very valid way to do it. So we'll do that, but let's look at an alternative approach once we've got it working, okay? So we want to make sure we're importing the link component from React Router DOM, right? So we always have to import anything we're wanting to use. And then what we're going to do is around this edit button, we're going to wrap it with our link component, okay? I really miss having Emmet when I use Codio. Okay, so we'll say link to, and since we are having to take a string and add it to a JavaScript variable, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could do it as it shows here. In quotes, add the /, do a plus, and then recipe ID. Or you could just do a string template literal, right? It's up to you. Really doesn't matter. As long as it works, that's the important thing, right? So what's happening here is since we wrap the link component around the edit button, when they click on this, it will take the user to /recipe ID, and since it is a link component, the entire application is not going to re-render. It's just going to be whatever components are needed to display the route we're going to. Okay. And then we're going back and utilizing the use params. And this is where that ID we're talking about is so important, right? So for us to access the ID from the route, we have to use what's called use params. And what that means, just as a reminder, is we want to use the parameters from the route, okay? So you could use param on any page, right? And the reason I say that is because maybe it's not a dynamic ID. Maybe it's just the route name you want to know. In my day-to-day application, we have certain pages where I want the background to be a different color than the rest. There's like maybe 5 pages out of 30 that should have a different color, okay? So we have something similar as use params where every time we go to a new page, we check what the route name is, okay? And if the route name matches one of the routes in an array, we will change the background color, and we'll actually thank you, by the way, Joseph, I saw. So yeah, I didn't catch that, but thanks for, I just want to let you know I saw your comment. So if the route matches that array, then we change the background color and we'll actually like hide certain elements, right? So using params doesn't necessarily have to be just to get a dynamic ID. Maybe we just want to know what the route name is. And if that route name is specific, we do certain logic, right? There's a multitude of reasons why you would use params. So don't just think of it as I need a dynamic ID. Okay. So fix the import. So now in our component, we want to destructure our recipe ID. So remind me, we could put const recipe ID equals use params up here, right? But why wouldn't we want to do that? Does anyone remember why we want to make sure it's inside of the component instead of above here? Oops. So it's all about how the component is going to be rendered in the scope, right? So if I initialize something up here, I'm technically initializing it before the component renders, right? So I could have something up here that says const sample text, right? And it just says hello. Now, if I want to use this over and over again and I'm not worried about it changing, yeah, I could throw it up here, not a big deal. You might see something like this where if you want a base URL, you'd put the const base URL above the component, right? Because that base URL is never going to change. At least it shouldn't, right? But you want to make sure all of your state and all of your non-actual constant variables are going inside of your component, okay? So now that we have the recipe ID through use params, we want to update the text, right? So instead of the H2 and it says update, we want to put the recipe ID. And in the example you see, it's a lowercase I. It should be uppercase I. Obviously, whatever you end up doing, just make sure it's consistent, okay? So now we should be able to run our server. And we're not going to be able to update anything yet. We just want to make sure the routing works correctly. Okay. So if I go here and click edit, okay. I'm wondering if it's because it's in there. Okay, so we're not seeing anything, and there's a reason for that, but let's see if we can troubleshoot that together. So, yep. And this is where talking about that consistency is important. So in here, I left the ID as lowercase, right? Because I was copying what they had. That's where that casing is really important, right? So if I go back to that page here and I restart the server, we should be good to go now. Yep. See, now we see a 1, right? So again, it's always good to double check. I probably could have pulled up the console and it would have told me that it didn't exist, but I already knew, right? So that's where, again, you may be following instructions from a different project, but you may not see an explicit error when you render the project, right? So I could go back in here just to show you. Go to source, app.jsx. I'll change that back to recipe ID. And if I looked at my console, it wouldn't necessarily say anything, right? Just because it's not finding that parameter doesn't mean that it's technically invalid. That's where it's you looking at the developer tools, it's always good, right? I'm not going to say don't do that, but it may not always show you the problem. So you may have to dig in a little bit. Okay, so let's go back then and let's see if I click on number 4. We're seeing number 4. Number 3 is number 3, right? And like I told you earlier, another way you could have handled the navigation, right, is if I go to recipe card, I was trying to think of where I was at. You could go in here. You could change that. You could say, is it on click, I think, and it is on click, right? React click event. I'm like second guessing myself here. Yep, on click, but it's lowered. Oh, yep, it is uppercase. Okay. You can say on click and then here you could say, I'm going to copy this. It's recipe ID. Okay. So then we can do use navigate, navigate equals use navigate. So you could either have a method that handles the navigation, right? Because maybe it's dynamic. Or you could just do on click. And like I was saying before, you could do something like this where you could say navigate and then let's do the template literals, right? And then recipe ID. So in essence, this should do the same thing. Double click. Cannot update a component browser add while rendering different component. Oh, yeah. Okay. So with strict mode, sometimes if you do the navigate in here, it may not work. So what you could do is handle navigation. And then navigate. And that should work better. So again, I mean, it's just kind of up to you, right? There's not a right or wrong way to do it. It's just depending on what your preference is and what your senior developer would want you to do. But ultimately, the link component does work. You just may want to have less elements on your page, right? Because when you add that link, then you have to wrap something in more components, which is then another element. So, okay. So we have the routing all set up. Is there anyone who got to this point and was not able to successfully route to your page and see the ID? Are we all caught up here? That's why I was trying to do a little bit of a side discussion to make sure you had time to get caught up. Looks like Esther's good. How about everyone else here? Joseph, Omar. Okay. So now we are going to make the form for our update component. Okay, so in our update component, we don't have a whole lot, right? We just have the recipe ID. So the nice thing is, pretty much it's going to be the same as what we saw in the create component, right? So that's where I'm going to go ahead and just copy this code because we've talked about it a few times, right? This here is pretty boilerplate for us. We have a label, we have our input. The only thing I'm going to change here is it says add new recipe, but it should be update recipe, right? We're not adding a new recipe, we're updating an existing recipe. So what's happening here is we have our use params, right? And what we're saying is we want that recipe ID. And then what will eventually happen is we're going to make a request to Supabase with that ID and the new information. And if everything lines up, if our API key checks out and everything else, then we should be able to update that recipe. Okay. So let's go ahead and set up our state, right? We're going to have to do that for our form like we've done prior. So let's import use state from React. It'd be so nice if you didn't have to do this each time, but not every component needs state. And we're going to copy all of this state, which is similar, if not identical, to what we've had prior, right? So name, set name, instructions, set instructions, time, set time, image URL, set image URL, right? And I'm going to go ahead and uppercase the URL again, like yesterday. So at this point, what we need to do is we need to add those on change event handlers. And if I had all of them from before, I would do that, but I think it's good here. Again, we can copy some of this, right? So let's go ahead. We could take the value and the on change from each input. Okay. So I'll paste that there. And just for formatting purposes, I'm going to put all these on a separate line. Remind me, when we have the value property here and it's being bound to this, what does that mean when it comes to our inputs in our form? While I'm copying and pasting all of this. So when we have a input and we have a value or even a text area, right? When we have a value prop and it's being set to a value, what does that binding actually mean? Why are we binding that value here? We want the input to take that value when the code runs. Yep. So we may have an initial value, right? Maybe we don't, but we want to say if this state here changes, well, we want this input to have that same value, right? We're creating a relationship between these two things when it did not exist prior, right? If we don't set up that binding, then those two things are not going to be related. Even if we want them to be, they're not going to be. Okay. So if you didn't copy and paste everything, and see even here, right? They said update recipe. It's just, it was a typo from the previous page. If you didn't copy and paste everything, then just go ahead and do that now. Because again, what we're doing is we're binding the values from each input to the state here, right? And then we're saying, hey, on the change event, I want to take that event data and I want to either set the name, time, instructions, or image URL based on the value of the target that we're listening for, right? So that's why we know, since it's this on change event, it's only going to set image URL, right? I'm not going to have to worry about the text area changing and then updating the image URL because I've differentiated these. Okay. So now we need to write a select query, but we only want one, right? And that's going to be based on the ID. We don't want to, let's say you had 100 recipes. Well, we don't want to get 100 recipes and then narrow it down to the recipe with that ID, right? That's incredibly inefficient and it would be just, it's overkill, right? There's no real good reason to do that when we can narrow it down to a specific recipe with that ID. And this goes for any kind of query you're writing, right? So in this example here, it's the same thing where in Supabase example, we're querying this table called countries, and we want to find where the name equals EQ Albania. So what we're going to do is we're going to destructure like we always have, data and error. We're going to call Supabase, create the client's already been created. We want to get information from the recipes table. We are going to select, right? Because you could say dot from recipes and then create, right? We could read, update, delete. So what we're doing right now is just reading it. So we're going to select, and we want it to be where equals ID, or where ID equals the recipe ID that we've gotten from our parameters, okay? And then what we're also saying is dot single. So and I'm asking this as an answer, should an ID, or should there ever be data that has the same ID, multiple pieces of data that have the same ID? It should be unique. It should be. Now, will there ever be exceptions? Yeah, absolutely. There will be. It's not impossible for a randomly generated ID to somehow be duplicated, right? Um, this is just a way to be very specific, right? Where if for some reason you selected all the IDs based on that ID and there was multiple, well, then you would try to render the multiple things, right? And that's just not what we want to do here. So we're saying, hey, we just want one, right? And that's a scenario where if for some reason you did select multiple IDs, then there needs to be something fixed with your database structure, right? You would probably hear about it. There'd probably be a what you'd consider a bug or a defect made, hopefully. But just to be safe, we're saying, hey, get me everything from the table where the ID equals this parameter that we have, but just give me one, okay? Just one row of data. That's all I want. Because you may use this in a scenario where, let's say you're trying to, I'm going to go back to Pokemon because everyone seems to connect to that. Let's say you're randomly generating Pokemon, right? And you want someone to, I want to randomly generate, on the page a fire Pokemon, right? So you could say const data error equals await Supabase dot from the table called Pokemon, select, give me all of the rows where type equals fire, but just give me one, single. That would be an instance where you would have multiples of something, but you only want one. Does that make sense to everyone? Why we would use dot single rather than getting everything and then trying to filter down with the UI, like with our code. We can just say, nope, give me everything from the table that fills this condition, but I just want one row of data. Okay. So we are going to use useEffect to do this, as we've done prior. Okay. So let's update useEffect in our imports here. And we also need to import Supabase from our configuration folder. So it should be // to go up one level, go into config, and then Supabase client. Okay. So what we want to do now is we want to import use navigate as well from the React router DOM. Okay. What's going to happen here is when we add this use effect hook, okay, and let's go ahead, yeah, for consistency's sake, we're going to add it under the state, okay. So what we want to do is we want to create a method called fetch recipe. So I'm going to write it how I normally do. I just do function or async function fetch recipe, okay. And remember, we will have to call it, right? We can't just create the method, we have to invoke it. So we want to have a try catch in here. All right, so try, we have a try catch, we have to do catch and then add the error parameter here. So here, and let's look at the example as well, just to make sure we're not missing anything. All right, so we'll say const data. And again, this is where we've seen const data and error, right? So kind of depends on how you want to do this, because you could say const data without error, and it's saying if data, do this, right? Because it's not going to return data if there's an error, but maybe you want to know what that error is. So that's where you kind of have to decide how you want to do this. But for the example, we're just destructuring data. We're going to say await Supabase dot from, and we're going to have recipes, right? Because that's the table we want to access. Dot select, because we want to read that data. Dot eq for equals, where ID is equal to recipe ID. And I have, again, I have mine a little different. Well, I should have. Okay. And then dot single, because we only want one. Okay. So under here, we're saying if data is truthy, right? If we're not receiving an empty object or an empty array or any kind of error, we're going to do set name and data dot name, right? And we know these property names because we're the ones that set up the columns, right? So by this point in our process, there shouldn't be really a guessing game of like, okay, well, let me do the API request first and see what I'm getting back. I mean, you should know what you're getting back because you've created the database, right? You set the schema to determine what kind of data is in there and what we should be retrieving. So we're just going through and setting all of this state. Okay. But if there's no data, we'll say, and I'll just put return here. I don't like if else's, to be honest. And then we'll say navigate to the home, and it says replace is true, which I believe, yeah, I don't think we actually talk about that. I think we'll get into that here in a second. Yeah, right here. We're using replace true because we want to prevent the user from being able to navigate back to the previous page using the browser's back button. Okay. I don't see this very often, just because of the architecture with our application, but this is a good, helpful thing to add in our navigate method here. Okay. All right. And then if there is an error, right, we're going to console.log error fetching recipe. And this is where I am, yeah, we'll leave it like this. And we're going to do the same thing here. We'll navigate, okay, and then we should be fetching the recipe. So again, we make our attempt to access data from the database. We just want a single record. And if we get the data, then we'll go ahead and set all the state. Otherwise, we're going to navigate back to the home page. Okay. Let's kind of troubleshoot this a bit. It seems to me when we have these two instances of navigate, we could probably consolidate that, but let's find out. Okay. So let's just start our server to make sure it works. Okay. Here's the preview. So if I click edit, so it looks like most of what I wanted updated, right? So that's good. So what did I mess up? And it's because right here, it should be set instructions, right? And then because that failed, this failed as well. Okay. So casing, plurality in words, super important. And unfortunately, since we're not using TypeScript, it's not always going to demonstrate those errors. Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to change recipe ID here to 27. Okay. And if I hit refresh, it should take me to the home page. Okay. Because, well, if data is not truthy, we should navigate here. Right. But I also want to see, well, is that because of the catch or is it because of the try? Or because of the try or the catch. So there's two ways we could figure this out, right? Because I'm all about consolidating code, not having it be repetitive. So if you remember, we can pull up our sources tab here, and I could pull up this file, which is called update.jsx here, okay? And I'm going to add a breakpoint to where this logic is happening. I'm going to call that one, and I'm going to add a breakpoint here. So I can't remember if we've gone over this. This is just, if we haven't, a brief introduction to the developer tools here, the debugger, right? So if this code is called, since I added breakpoints here, it will actually stop the code. Okay, so I'm going to hit edit, and we can see here that line 28, it was stopped, right? Because data was null. So we're calling the navigate, okay? But then the error is still being called too, right? So technically we're navigating the user multiple times. Now you're going to see it didn't navigate because whenever you do a debugger, sometimes it will like slow down a little bit. Actually, let's see. It might not have worked also because I did not set up I thought it set it up in here. You need to do const navigate equals use navigate. See, and that's where debuggers are really helpful because it showed me that here on the side, it had an error saying navigate was not defined. Okay, so now it's defined. Let's go back in here, hit edit. And now it's moving so quickly and going back that it's actually not even, well, I've got to add the breakpoint here, sorry. So we had the breakpoint, it got moved because I added a line. Okay, so I hit edit, and it's actually not calling the catch, which is interesting, right? And I'm wondering if we do that, it's because we're not throwing that error. So technically, this catch is almost, I wouldn't say unnecessary, right? We see that this is being called here. So let's see if we could remove this line and it would still work. Okay. So we do that. And see, and it doesn't work. So really what we should be doing is figuring out if this isn't working, we should be throwing an error, right? That's ideally what we should be doing instead of having the same code twice. We could say throw new error, recipe not found, right? And then see that console that was triggered, and now it's navigating back. Okay. Again, it's not the end of the world to have two lines of code that are the same thing, but let's say you do that 3 or 4 times, and then that piece of logic gets changed. Well, now you have to change it in 4 places, right? So it's not the best approach, but again, it's not the end of the world, right? That's why I would just like to help show you, like, it makes sense to write cleaner code where you're not having to maintain the same functionality in multiple places. Okay? Any questions about what we just did with the populating the update page, right? And the refactoring there. Any questions? Are we clear? I'm going to change that back to recipe ID. Should be able to go in here and view everything correctly. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and write our update query, right? To me, this is the fun part is, okay, well, we already know how to get the recipes. How can we update them? So looking here at this example query, we want to, here they have it destructured as an error, right? Because if you think about it, if you update something, the only thing you care about is, well, did it update, right? You don't necessarily need anything back from the database except saying, hey, you're good to go, right? So that's where we're looking for an error, just to be like, well, if there's an error, it didn't update. Otherwise, we're good. I don't need any data back, right? So everything up here is the same, dot from table name, but then it's dot update, and we're specifying what we want to update here, right? And it's where the equality of an ID or whatever the case is, and then that variable that we're updating. So in our example, what it look like is const data and error, which again, do we need the data? Not necessarily, but it's there. We want to look at the recipes table, and then we're going to update just like what we had before in our post, right? When we created our recipe. The difference is, rather than creating a recipe, we're just updating it, right? So this part here is going to look exactly the same as yesterday, but what we're adding on here is to say, yeah, but only do this for a entry where the ID equals recipe ID. So if you remember when we updated in our SQL query the other day, and I'm like, I want everybody to be Tom Thanks, or I can't remember which one we did, and I didn't specify where X equals something else, all of the actors updated, right? And it was a nightmare. You couldn't do that. So that's where we have to specify, yes, I want to update these columns with these values, but only where the ID equals the recipe ID we got from the route. Okay. So this logic, pretty straightforward. It's going to be similar to what we've had, right? So let's go ahead and create our method here of handle submit. Now I'm going to ask, because we talked about it yesterday, there was a shorthand way of how we could update a few things. Okay. So right now we're just saying if name is not valid, or if instructions is not valid, or if time is not valid, or if image URL is not valid, we want to set form error. You know what you did wrong. And then we're going to return, right? Now, at this point, we're going to say const data and error. And I'm actually going to I'm going to leave data in because I want to show you what it comes back as. So data and error equals await supabase dot from tables or recipes. I'm thinking it's a table dot update. So inside of here, we're updating 4 columns: name, prep time, instructions, and image URL. Does anyone remember how I made this shorthand yesterday and why I was able to do that? I'm doing it longer right now, but does anyone remember? So Sarah says name. Yes, name was one of them. What did I do with name? If it's the same, you just write it once. Yep, if they're the same, you don't have to repeat it. So we could just say name and instructions, right? And that's something to consider where if you have control of the database, think ahead, right? And be like, oh, I could just make prep time, you know, be prep time here too, right? It's up to you. Unless you're working on another team, then it's not up to you. But when you see they're the same, just do it, right? So after we've created that object of what we want to update, we need to specify equals, and then where ID is the same as recipe ID. Okay. I'm going to use the debugger to see what the data looks like at this point. Actually, that's probably, we'll just do a console.warn, and I'll do data. And then so if error is truthy, right, then we'll set form error. You still know what you did wrong. Otherwise, we could add a return here, right? Because I don't like my else's. And then we could just say set form error is null and navigate to the main page. Now, in this situation here, you'll notice we're not doing a try catch, right? And that's where you kind of have to decide how you want to handle a try catch. I lean towards just doing try catches all the time. In this example, they don't have that. It's okay. I would just say find when you're making these asynchronous calls, I just tend to lean towards doing a try catch. Okay. All right. So we have our handle submit, but we still have to add this somewhere, right? So we have to do the on submit event, and then handle submit. Now, the nice thing is here, where we have the handle submit, we're not worried about any event data, right? We actually only care about the state that we've set up, okay? And I take that back. The only event data we do care about is for the prevent default, right? But it's not event data like with our on change, right? It's just saying, hey, when this event fires, do this, but really, we've already got all the data we need, right? We don't have to pay attention to any event in the form, except for the fact that we don't want it to refresh. Okay. So just refresh. We've done this already, but if these pieces of state are not valid, we'll set the form error. We'll break out of the method, right? Otherwise, we're going to make the call to supabase. And then if there's an error, we set a form error. Otherwise, form error is null, and we're going to navigate back home. Okay. Now down here, it looks like we still need to add that form error. So let's go ahead and do that. That's going to be underneath the button. Okay. And let's make sure it's working correctly. Okay. So let's hit edit. And I'm going to change the S at the end to bytes. Like it's a millennial who's doing this. Hit update recipe. And now, here it is. But interesting. Why is it at the bottom? Let's take a look. Table editor. It's because, actually, it's interesting. It's probably going off of the updated by would be my guess. We look here at our request. Let's open it up. Because it's not necessarily going to default based on the ID, right? So if we look here at our network call and I hit refresh, it's selecting all the recipes, right? That's all we're saying is select recipe. So you'll notice here 2, 3, 4, and 1, right? Because these are the ones that are updated. This goes from oldest to most recent. Okay. So I could update the pizza, update that there, and now it's down here. Okay. So just remember, like, unless you set some filtering to display it a certain way, it's going to be returned based on whatever your database is doing, right? And we see here the database is returning not based on the ID, but based on the created at update here. Now, you could have it set up where maybe you filter based on not created at, but updated at, right? So maybe you have two fields, created at, updated at. Again, it's up to you, okay? Now, if you remember, what I said was let's do a console warn for the data, right? So you see down here, it's null because it's not returning any data. If you look here in our network request, we see it's a 204. I know it says right here, but if you remember all the status codes we talked about, a 204 means no content. What's saying is there's a network request, it needs to let you know, hey, we're good, but we're not returning anything back, right? And we see a request method of patch. That means update, right? We're patching. It's like if you have a shirt and there's a hole, you may put a patch on it, right, to fix it. So we are updating something, but the database is not returning anything back to us. So realistically, we don't even need to destructure that data because we literally wouldn't get anything back, even if, even if the request is successful. Okay. So again, I wanted to demonstrate that. If I did it in the debugger, it would have said null, but for different reasons. So I wanted to confirm that, okay, well, if we don't need to do anything with it, then why destructure it, right? That's just extra code to worry about. Could be confusing, right? And be like, well, what are we doing with this? Actually, nothing. So why do we have it? That's a good question. And let's make sure our error validation is working, right? So I could clear this out, hit update recipe. You know what you did wrong, right? And then I could go in here, say equal ID of 55. Okay, I hit update recipe. And it looks like the patch would work in that sense only because I think it would probably create a new record. No, it's not going to. So what would happen in that instance then? Let's see. Let's change this back to recipe ID. But if there's not a valid table, right? If I change that to recipe and hit refresh, then we should see that other error message. So I hit edit, update recipe. You still know what you did wrong, right? And that's this error here. So it's good to make sure we have errors for different scenarios, right? The first one being, hey, you didn't fill everything out, display an error. Then if there's an issue with the API, have a different error from there. Okay. We have one more step and one more feature. Are we good to finish this feature out before we take our break? How are we feeling about that? Because I want to make sure you get a good amount of time for the lab to really go heads down on that. Yeah, I think we can push through. I think working on it while our while we're thinking about it now makes the most sense, but I wanted to see how everyone's doing. All right, we got thumbs up squad in here. Awesome. Let's move forward. All right, so now we want to write our delete query. So this one's pretty straightforward, right? We've already seen the equals method based on, okay, we want to hit only get the ID where it matches something else. But now all we do is we call this delete method, right? So we're saying, hey, from recipes, right, dot delete, where the ID column equals this deleted recipe ID. Okay. Now we don't have that deleted recipe ID quite yet. We're going to have to make that state. Okay. So where are we going to handle this? It's going to be in the home page. I know it's not up here, but you remember we added that delete button, right? So we don't have to go into the recipe to handle that. We're just going to be deleting that specific recipe from the home page. So let's go ahead and make our method. So I'll do it like I've done before. I want to get you familiar with both kinds of ways to write a method in React. So it needs to be async, not async, async function handle recipe delete. And inside of here, we want to pass in a parameter of deleted recipe ID. Okay. So here we have our try catch, right? Like I said, not always consistent in how we do this, but I would argue you should always do a try catch. So in our try, we're going to say const error equals await supabase dot from recipes dot delete dot eq for equals where ID equals deleted recipe ID. Okay. Now we're going to say if there's an error, throw new error failed to delete the recipe. Please try again. Okay. If there's no error, right, then we can just move on. Set recipes, and this is where we need to talk about what we're doing here. Recipes dot filter. We're going to say recipe arrow where recipe ID does not equal deleted recipe ID. Okay. I'm not going to add anything in the error right now in the catch. So let's break this down, right? We have a method called handle recipe delete, where we're going to pass in the ID of the recipe we want to delete, which we haven't determined how to do that yet. Let's just look at the method. And inside of here, we're destructuring the error that we could possibly get from this request, but we're making a request to our Supabase database from the recipes table. We're saying, hey, we want to call the delete method where the ID column equals the deleted recipe ID. If we get an error back, we want to throw this new error, right? We haven't determined what to do with that yet. Otherwise, we're going to set the recipes. And this is where I want you to think through this, okay? You're totally allowed to be wrong, but I want someone to try to answer this, what they think is happening here. So we're saying recipes.filter, right? We've already talked about filter, where each recipe we want to filter where the recipe ID does not equal the deleted recipe ID. Why do you think we are filtering in this way? I think we know what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to be like, hey, we want to delete that recipe, not just from the database, but we don't want to display it, right? But why do we have to do it like this? All guesses are totally welcome here. It looks like we have a few people typing. Give it another few seconds. So we don't want to delete the ID that we have already deleted. So not quite. I think I know where you're going with that. What's happening here is we've already deleted that ID, right? But we haven't made a new API request to retrieve all of the current recipes, right? And we don't want to necessarily do that, right? We don't need to make a new API request when we've already deleted something and we know we've deleted it. So instead, what we're doing is we're resetting that state to update on that page without a re-render, right? So we're saying, hey, we know what all the recipes are, right? We've deleted this one. So reset the state to everything except the one that has this ID, right? And then it'll refresh. That recipe card won't be up there anymore. And again, we don't have to make another API request. So think about it from a user standpoint or, scalability, right? Let's say you had 100 people on your recipe card application, right, at one time. Imagine how many API requests would have to be made every single time they load the page, make a new request, edit a recipe, right? Delete a recipe. Where you can minimize those requests, the better. It's not just a performance thing, but the cost, right? We talked about how there's a limit to how many API requests you can make on a free plan. And this is something where you can update the UI without having to make that API request. So that's where we want to update that state and we want to filter out the recipe that we just deleted. Okay. It's not like a hack, right? It's literally just saying, hey, you know what? This is a simple way to update the application without having to make another API request. Okay. So what we need to do is we've done that, but we need to pass that handle recipe delete as a prop. Okay. So let's look down here on our recipe card. I'm going to format this a little bit, make it look better. Okay. I'm going to say on delete, right? Because we get to name that prop that we want. We're going to say handle recipe delete. Okay. So now in that recipe card on the next page, we're going to be able to get the data that we need. Okay. So let's go over to the next page where we see recipe card. So since we're passing a prop down, we have to destructure that prop, right? We can't just access it without adding it to the parameters of our function. So we say on delete, and then we need to make a new method. So const handle delete, right? And we'll do async. So we have a try catch here, right? So we're going to say await on delete, and we're going to pass in the recipe.id. Catch error. Yeah, we'll just do console.error, error deleting recipe. We'll pass in the error here. Okay. So what this means is, if you go back to our home component, right, when this on delete, we're passing down to be handle recipe delete. So when handle delete is called, we're going to call the on delete, right? That event is going to be called. It's again, we're thinking of it goes down, but then it goes back up. Okay, so this function is going to be called when the user clicks on the delete button associated with the recipe card. So we have to now add that, right? So we have to go here to the on click and say handle delete. Okay, so on click calls handle delete, then calls on delete, right? And then now, where did I? Yep, handle recipe delete, just making sure I'm not forgetting something here. Yep, okay. So again, the back and forth can be a little confusing even for me. So on click, we call handle delete, right? Handle delete and then calls on delete. And we see on the home page, go back into here, home, and then we have the on delete here, right? Which is the handle recipe delete. So then handle recipe delete, that's where we're going to try to delete the recipe. Okay. It's a lot of back and forth, a lot of prop drilling, but it's easier this than having everything in a single page, right? Can you think through what our application would look like if this was not a component? If it was not componentized, right? If everything was in the same component, we'd probably be about almost 1,000 lines long at this point. It's a lot because you would have to make your code. You couldn't have it as reusable, right? It would be very specified. There would be a lot going on. So that's where prop drilling can be confusing, but the process is very intuitive, where we pass down what we want to be called. It gets passed down, utilized, and then passed back up. So now, if everything was done correctly, which I hope it is, we should be able to delete our recipes. Okay. So if I go here, I want to get rid of my pizza recipe. I hit delete. Okay. Well, that looks good, but did it actually get deleted? Let's find out. Okay. So looks fine, right? I hit delete, and we see here it made a call where the ID equaled 1. And we see the request method was delete, like it should have been. And here we also see what we saw before, no content, right? The database doesn't need to send us anything back. We're good. So just to make sure, the error is where it should be as well, we can go here, pull up our file tree. I'm going to go back to home, or what was it in? It's in recipe card, right? Yep. But I do have to go back up here to home. And then I'm going to change this to recipe. So then I should see a new error in the console when I hit delete. Yep. So again, the error is not very descriptive, right? But it tells me what the error is. It says not found, which is true. That table is not found. So I will get a 404. And let's verify too. I'll hit refresh. Oh, I didn't even have to refresh, right? I gave it a second and it updated. So you should be able to go into your table after deleting and see that everything you deleted is now no longer in there. Okay. How many of you were able to get to this point without having issues? I didn't see anything in the chat. Veronica, I don't know if you had anyone message you. So who was able to get to this point? I want to make sure before we take our break, are we good? Okay. So it is 22 after. Let's go to 33. By the time I get done talking, it'll probably be another minute. So yeah, 33 after, we'll come back and then we're going to talk about the Notes app, and that will be the rest of our lesson. All right. Let's drop something in the chat. Let me know you're back, and then we'll get started on the lab. right, Chris is back. Omar is back with the wiggle. All right. So our lab preview, we are making a notes application. As you see here, not a whole lot like UI wise, maybe all designed up, right? But that's not the point here. What we're trying to do is create a new Supabase database and integrate it into this notes application. Okay. So there's going to be a couple steps here. Now, the styling, all right, has been done. The app JSX has some logic in there, right? So really what we need to do is create a notes table in Supabase. We need to connect it to our project. We need to fetch existing notes from the database. We'll need to insert new notes, and we also need to be able to add delete functionality. So you're going to notice we're not updating notes, right? That's something where I would challenge you if you have the time, try it out, right? But these are the main steps. Create the table, connect it to your database, your project to the database, fetch existing notes from your database, be able to add new notes, and be able to delete the notes. Okay? So again, the app JSX has all the logic required for the application. You won't need to add any new components. The Supabase client.jsx file has been set up, so you should be able to communicate with the database, but you will have to update the file with your credentials. Okay? So go ahead. It is 35 after. I would like to be able to meet back at 15 after so we can go over this the last 15 minutes. If you'd like a little bit more time to go over it, let me know, because that would give us 15 minutes, obviously, to go over that together. It's up to y'all. I'm happy to jump in, obviously, as needed, but you do have the steps for the task here, right? So each task is going to be broken down to let you know what needs to be done. But please, please, please reference the recipe book that we just made, right? That is going to have the core logic you need to be able to complete this lab successfully. If you do not remember the settings to create a new table, we do have this for you here as well. So yeah, you should be able to create the table, call it whatever you need to, add the correct columns, and then get your database hooked up to your application. Any questions before we separate here and start working? Okay. So 15 after, so that gives you roughly, what is that, about a little under 40 minutes to get this lab done. Okay. So it should be a good amount of time here. Any questions, please drop them in the chat, ping me, ping Veronica, and we'll get you sorted out. Okay? Okay. So as always, let's drop something in the chat. Let me know you're here, not out gallivanting and who knows where. I'm going to go ahead and get my terminal started up. All right. So if you started up the application, this is what you should see, right? We could add a new note. Nothing's happening, right? Because the core functionalities there were just not quite up to snuff yet. So what we need to do is create a table in Supabase called notes. Make sure you follow these instructions, right? That should be, I would say, easy at this point. We've done that. Everything's here for us to do. Okay. Now we need to connect our application to our database. So we need our base URL, right? So I'm going to go back here to home, get my project URL. And remember, and I say remember, I threw this in the chat, but if you added the table to your existing project, your project URL and your API key will be the same. Okay. Now, it's not typically best practice to have unrelated tables in a single project, but for the sake of this exercise, totally fine. Okay. So the env change, you see it restarted the server, so we're good to here, good to go here. Okay. Now I am going to use the solution just for the sake of time. Okay. Which, yep, right here. Okay. So first thing we want to do is we need to write our fetch notes method. Okay. Now there's things we need to do first before we even really get to that point, which it's already been done, right? We have some state that's been created, but we do need to import Supabase, which has been commented out here, right? Because if you don't set it up and it's uncommented, it might throw an error. But we're looking fine, so we should be okay. All right. So let's write our fetch note method. Okay, so you see here it's done a little differently. We have the use effect here and fetch notes, and then fetch notes is down here. It's really up to you to decide how you want to do that. So with our fetch notes method, we are calling Supabase, right? With our client we've created, we're accessing the notes table and we're selecting everything. And we're saying if there's an error, console log that error. Otherwise, we want to set the notes to that data. Okay. Now, after this, again, we still need to do the use effect, right? So let's add that down here. And again, if we have that empty array, it means that this should only run once per component render. Okay. But for us to properly display the notes, we're going to have to map them down here, right? So we kind of have some of this set up, but let's get rid of this, right? So we'll get rid of everything in here. We want to leave the button, right, to add a note, and we do still want that unordered list. We don't need to make multiple versions of an unordered list based on how many notes we have, right? So we have to pay attention to where we're adding that mapping. So we'll do notes, right, because we have that state called notes, dot map, and each individual one's just going to be a note, okay? Make sure you add your parentheses, and then we're going to do a list item, and the key is going to be note.id, okay? And inside of this list item, we want to display that note. So we're going to create a span. We'll do note.note. And then we're also going to have a button with an onClick method, but we don't have anything in here yet, right? We haven't quite got to that. So I'm just going to do an anonymous anonymous function, say alert deleted, right? And you'll notice here it's being called with a note ID, but again, we don't have that yet. So let's not worry about that. We'll say delete. So at this point, if I hit refresh, yeah, we shouldn't have anything right now. right? Because we don't have any notes in here yet. So that at this point, we're where we want to be. If we open this up in a new browser, we can see here our network tab. I hit refresh. We're selecting notes, and there's nothing here. So I would say this is success so far, right? So let's manually add a note, right? Let's make sure it works. So if you remember, we can go here to insert row, and the note is going to be take son to piano lessons. Hit save, hit refresh, and what do you know? It's there. I hit delete. It's not actually deleted, right? But we know that method is being called, that event's being fired. But we can see here, we're getting everything we need, right? And all we did was hook up our env file, right? We went up here, we created a method called fetch notes. We called Supabase, we selected the notes table, and we're just saying, give us everything, right? And then we're taking that data that we've destructured here, and we're setting our state of here, right, with set notes. So this part here was already set up for you, right? And then making sure when the component renders, we call that so that we can get the most recent version of all the notes in our database. So that's step 3, okay, task 3. Now we need to add a function to add new notes. Okay, so let's make that method. Say, we'll do it under the comments, right? Const add note. We'll do async. And again, we'll reference the solution here because we're going to still talk through it. So what we're going to say is if new note is falsy, right? If there is no new note in our input, right? And you'll see here, we are going to have to tie that together, right? You'll look here, they've done it in the solution, but we haven't quite got there yet. But we do have a state saying if, new note. So if new note is falsy, return, right? We don't want to add an empty note. Otherwise, we're going to destructure the error message, right? Because if we're just adding something, we don't need to worry about a response as long as there's no error. Await Supabase dot from notes insert, and this one's gonna be pretty easy, right? Is we're just saying note equals new note. Okay. After this, we can say if error. You can do console dot error. Let's throw that error. I know it's not a try catch here. Again, just kind of referencing what was here, what you would have seen. And then after that, we want to make sure we have the most recent version of the notes, right? So then we can do fetch notes. Now, I would argue this isn't the best approach, right? I would argue you could just set the state with the spread operator, right? And add that in there. But this is how the solution is, and we don't have time to really get deep into refactoring. So again, just to confirm, if there's no note, new note here, which we need to bind here, right? So we set value to be new note, okay? If that's falsy, break out of the method. Otherwise, we're going to try to insert that note, okay? So what they didn't necessarily put in here again was that, right? That we need to bind that value. But we have gone over that enough where that should be really at the forefront of your mind, right? Is remembering that you need to be doing that, where you need to have that on change event here, right? So we would say, we would look for the event and then set a new note to be e.target.value, okay? So at this point, I should be able to refresh, bring son home from piano lessons. Okay. Now there could still be a error here. And let's see what's going on. actually not, I may have not hooked that up. Yeah, right here. So then we have to do on click, right? And then we do, oh wait, oh, parentheses, I'm thinking Angular. Okay, and then we call add note. I was like, it should be working. Okay, so hit refresh. Okay, so we see here, bring son home from piano lessons. Okay, so we have the method we made. We bound the value to the input. On the on change, we're setting that state, that value. And then on the on click for the add note, we're actually adding the note. Okay. And then last, we just need to delete any note. So we already kind of have that set up. It's not quite right. So we at least have the delete button there. We're already thinking about what we need to be doing, right? So now we can create a method called const handle delete. This also needs to be asynchronous. And the way that the solution has it is, well, let's destructure the error message that we get back from the API. Okay. Now I'm leaving something out for right now. We'll come back to it. And we're going to say await supabase dot from notes dot delete. And if you remember, we have to have that equality here. We don't want to delete everything, right? So we're just saying delete the one where the ID column equals ID. Well, how do we get ID? We have to pass it in through here, right? So the way that the solution has it is we call onClick method, right? We listen for the onClick method on this button, and we say delete note, and we say note.id. Okay, and I think they have it a little differently here in the comments. Yeah, they say, yep, delete note. That was my bad. Okay, so we have delete note here. We pass in whatever that ID is, right? So then inside of here, as an argument, we could just say ID. Okay, because the method in the event is passing in that ID. So we're saying delete anything from the database that equals that ID, right? And you could delete multiple items, right? You could say anything with a name of Patrick, right? Delete all Patricks. You could do that. So then we say if error, let's console.error what the error is. Otherwise, we're going to set notes to what we saw before. Notes.filter note, well, note.id does not equal ID, right? So we don't want to include that note in our list anymore. So I could delete this ID. We're good to go. I not only hit refresh and I see that one note, we see there's only one note in here, right? Feed lizards, okay? I refresh, I see that here. I hit delete, I add a new note that says eat dinner, add the note, go back to my table, and everything is updating as expected. Okay? So again, the solution was here for you to reference, but all of this, the structure, is taken exactly from what we saw in our lesson today. Okay? So the idea of fetching data to populate our UI, making a request to add a new item to our database, and then rendering it, right? And deleting an item from our database, and then making sure we're re-rendering what we see there. I know we're at 30 after. How are we feeling about this lab now that we've gone over the solution? Does this all make more sense now that you've looked at it? And again, we're not going to spell everything out to every single detail, right? Because again, like the on change and the value binding, a lot of that we've seen numerous times. So by this point, we're hoping that you've started thinking that way, right? But again, that's why we provide that solution. So if you get stuck, hopefully you can reference it and get yourself unstuck. So I know we're out of time, but thoughts, how are we feeling? Because we're not going to see each other again until next week. So I want to make sure we're feeling good before we get out of here. I'll take it, Omar. I will take it. Yep. I'm glad it makes more sense. My suggestion for you is if you have time this weekend, don't replicate this project, but maybe make something similar, right? Make a table where you're tracking workouts. Make a table where you're tracking like a diet planning thing, right? Find something, just make an app. Don't worry about the styling, right? Unless you want to, but just take something that's similar to this, right? Use Stackblitz, use VS Code, whatever you want, and just pretty much make the same application, just a different subject matter. And I promise you, if you do that once or twice outside of here, you'll have the project as well. But the more you do this, it's going to click, I promise. So find something that might make sense to you, right? Be like, hey, it'd be nice to keep track of this. Um, yep, exactly. Refactoring project date. Do it. I would love to see that. Right. That's exactly the mindset to have. So if you have any questions, I know I'm not your TA, but please don't hesitate to reach out. I do check Slack over the weekend to make sure Yvonne's not yelling at me. Just kidding. But I do check Slack just to make sure everyone's doing okay. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Please make sure you're scheduling office hours with Veronica. Okay? Do you have anything else before we go? Okay. Awesome, Veronica. Everyone else good? Otherwise, I think I want to say ready for the weekend, but now it's only Tuesday. It feels like it should be, though. I'm used to Thursdays being the last day. I think you're on mute. Just a heads up.
Okay, perfect.